Hey, so guys, I wanted to take a real quick moment, at least I'm going to try to be real quick. I wanted to do a video review of what we went over last week in trying to get everybody involved in the Galatians study. Once again, I am extremely excited about the opportunity to lead us through this book because it's one of my favorite letters from Paul, and it just really puts us into a focus of the gospel. And so I wanted to really kind of touch base on that real quick and just kind of go over what we went over last week and then even touch on what we did the week before. So if you remember, the week before we discussed what Paul's introduction, what that meant, what that was like. So I've got my computer up here and I'm going to try to bring up or just give myself a little bit of review. So if you see me looking away from the screen, you'll see why. You'll know why. So what we looked at as far as the introduction goes is we looked at who Paul is, how he writes his introductions. And for Galatians, I said that it was an introduction that was a little bit different than a lot of his other letters. You can tell in his introductions to, say, in Romans or in Ephesians or in Colossians, which is the one we just did not too long ago, you can tell that he was really involved as far as setting up an introduction, explaining who he was, and really kind of setting his letter off right. But in Galatians, it was a little bit different of a story. He had the same points. In all of his introductions, he always looks at 3 points in his introduction. First off, he looks at his ministry, and then he looks at his message, and then he also looks at his motive. And those are kind of 3 sections you can actually see coming out of his introductions. But in Galatians, he did do that. However, it was a lot quicker. And as we mentioned last week, I said, hey, he did that because there was an urgency in what he was trying to do. And he really wanted to kind of lay it out there for people to know who he was and why he was doing this and why he had the authority to do this. But then he also wanted to make sure that the people heard his message, that he was able to get right on it because something was happening in Galatia at the time to his churches there, and he wanted to make sure that he addressed that right off the bat. And so you'll see that as you read through the first 5 verses or so, and kind of going in there. I'm not going to go too much more in depth because we're going to see more about that as we move on. And we talked about his authority and why he has that, and we're going to actually dive more into his authority next week. We're going to be discussing. Paul will be sharing his testimony basically in the next couple sections of verses and just being able to take from that and understanding why he has the authority that he has. Okay, so when we jumped off of the introduction, we then moved on. And really what I did with this was I said, you know what? Paul is putting out a statement that we really need to make sure that we take a hold of. And what I did was I did this. I said, here is the gospel. And I'm hoping this comes through okay on the video. And I apologize, but it does look like that red's going to be a little bit light. I'm using some other people's markers. But here's the gospel, okay? And that's really not going to come in. I'm going to bring the camera up just a little bit to see what kind of point we're getting to, okay? So so we're going to talk about the gospel that Paul preached. And what these sets of verses really did was it stated, there is no other gospel. And so when people try to add on to it, and what I mentioned before is if I do this, does that make the gospel the same? And the real answer is no, it doesn't. Because I've just added to the gospel, right? And so then I did this where I took that away and we're back to our true core gospel. And I said, well, does that make it the gospel? and I took away the letter. I said, no, because I took away from the gospel. And so what Paul was really trying to refer to here is that anytime anybody takes away from the gospel or tries to add to it, then they are changing the gospel completely. And you'll see that in the verses that he wrote in here in the Galatians. We were in Galatians 1, chapter 1, verses 6 through 10, and it says, in these verses, it says, I am astounded that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. And so what was happening was there were people that were saying, hey, it's not just about the gospel. They had some of the Jewish people, some of the Jewish individuals that were considered Jewish Christians, or they called them Judaizers in some of my theological references. And so what the Judaizers were doing was they were saying, hey, you know what? Okay, believe that Christ died and rose again, but, and they would add to it, and so they would take and they would distort the gospel and say, well, it's not all about that. You can't just believe that Christ did this. You've also, with the Jewish tradition, they said, well, you also have to be circumcised, or you also have to follow some of these laws. And so they were adding things onto it. And there were some other people in there that say the Gentile influence from the Roman Empire. They would say, okay, well, maybe this part isn't necessary. And they would start taking away from the gospel. And so what was happening was it was deceiving the people. And all of a sudden you started seeing people leave the church, or you would start seeing people go a different way and just change the outcome of their church completely. And Paul wanted to make sure that he addressed that situation immediately. Now, some notes that I had written down here about this. First off, what Paul was seeing when he came along this, he had this expression of anxiety. He wrote, and there are different variations of translation to how he may have stated it when he wrote it. I was reading out of the ESV Bible, and it said that I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the gospel. And so just that word choice, just this idea, and even in the Greek, it showed that it wasn't, he was coming in with this notion of, I love you guys, but I'm so shocked. I cannot understand how quickly you've gone through and done this. And so you see him just kind of pushing and just kind of fleshing out the fact that these guys were deserting everything that he had taught them. And he really started to show concern, and he started to show a sense of anxiety as far as how that could impact God's church and how that would impact the future of God's church in the Galatian area. You would hear him speak of Antioch a lot in Acts when you start hearing about his journeys going to and from Antioch. And you could almost sense that there was a sense of need to be there for him. He had a real notion. I believe that was probably one of the first areas that he really went to with a couple people. And we'll read a little bit more about that further on in Galatians. And when he went to Antioch, he founded a church there, and it was, I really believe, if you could have your favorites, I believe Antioch was probably one of those for him. I think he just had this real heart for that area, just the way some of his writings portray it, and then the way his accounts were in Acts. But he was really concerned about what was going on, and really needed to make sure that they were aware of what was happening. So some things that he brought out in this is that, God called them in his grace and saved them from their sins, and now they were moving back into the law. A lot of the Jewish people who were claiming to be freed from the law through the gospel were all of a sudden going, ooh, you know what, you're right. And they started stepping backwards. And I know if you all like me, we've experienced times where where we started putting things in front of it, and so it kind of pushed us back and pushed it back. And the Jewish people were experiencing some of the same things. There was a statement that was made out of Warren Wiersbe's book on Galatians, and he stated, his commentary, he stated this. He said, they were abandoning liberty for legalism. That was such an eye-opening statement for me as I was kind of looking through that, and unfortunately I was really kind of having a wow, what is happening in society today? And I started seeing that reflect on a lot of decisions that are happening in our society today. And then kind of looking at the church and the church as a whole, and I'm really kind of seeing how even church-going individuals seem to be going backwards a little bit. They're giving up the liberty for that legalism. And so as I began to really kind of chew on that kind of statement for a while, I could see how Paul was getting a little bit anxious because of what he had worked so hard for, and how he had worked through Christ, or how Christ had worked through him to introduce the gospel to these people. I could see where it was becoming a burden for him. So I also noted that they had become infatuated with the religion of the Judaizers. Just the way little children follows a stranger because he offers them candy. Isn't that kind of a weird statement? And it's something that kind of makes you scratch your head. Because as we look at it, and we look back at the Jewish law, and we're sitting there thinking, well, what on earth? If the gospel gives them a way to separate themselves from the law, and we've seen, you read Old Testament, you can see some of the crazy laws that the Jewish people had. Why on earth would we want to go back to that? And as I was really kind of thinking about that, and we're hashing that out, and in class we discussed some thoughts, and I'll ask you guys this. Below you can set comments below. Believe me, you can send comments below. I welcome them. Anything, set up below. I'll request that later on. But I'm going to ask you, what would make somebody give up their freedom and go back and almost entertain the idea of having some kind of law to it? For me, my response would be, I'm a person that really kind of likes things in order, right? I like to organize some things, and I like to have a way that I can just check off things. They call me very systematic, right? In my work, sometimes if things aren't going as I had planned, it kind of throws me off. And so true in the moment when I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about my walk with Christ, all too often I want to sit here and I want to have a checklist, right? I want to go, well, okay, I prayed today, I read my Bible today, I even read a little bit about, I read another book, a little bit more of a life challenge, Christian lifestyle book, and maybe even listen to a sermon on a podcast. There you go. I did it. And I make my day out, And by the end of the day, okay, now I got to pray. And a lot of times even our prayer life becomes systematic. Well, when I pray, I've got to say, okay, Our Father a bunch of times and make sure I add in some Lords to make it that way, right? So why is that really, is that what he's really saying about all this? So let me ask you guys something. To you, why is it so difficult for us to hold on to the gospel? What is it? Why do we feel like we need to add on to it? Is it possible that we think it's too easy? Let's face it. What's the gospel? What is it? Basically, all we have to know is recognize the fact that we're sinners and we're going to go to hell without Christ. Right? That Christ died on the cross for us, and all we have to do is believe in Him, and we're saved. We have a ticket to heaven. And that really, and I'm not playing it down any. That is really the simplicity of it. Is it possible that we sit here and we think, well, that's just too easy? Is it possible that we can't grasp our heads around it because we just go, oh man, that the gospel, well, there's got to be more to it, right? I mean, I can't just go out as I am and say, that can't be right. I got to be able to do something. I got to make sure that I'm wearing and supporting a church, which ironically is what I'm doing right now, right? I got to make sure that I'm doing this, doing that, do this. I got to make sure I step in the right direction. And then get to the gospel. Guys, it is that easy. Christ said that all you have to do is follow Him. Listen, why is it that easy? What is the gospel truly about? And that was what we came to a conclusion on. To what it really is. Why does it become that easy for us? Because of grace. And right underneath it, I said grace. Do you know what grace is? Do you understand what grace is? You know what? It's a bigger word than it looks, isn't it? Because we can't wrap our heads around what true grace really means. Grace means undeserved favor. Undeserved favor. It means we can do nothing for that. And you know what happens is all too often we feel like we have to do something for that. And God said, no, you don't do anything for it. You know, He said, I favored you from the beginning. You don't do anything. When did He favor us? Back in Genesis, when He created us, and He said that you're not just good, but this creation is extra good. Very good. Excellent. We are the crown jewel, as has been said. God gave us the favor, and we could not do anything for it. Guys, all this book, our focus is going to be on the gospel and what it means and how God's grace impacted us. And it really is going to be that simple, but there's so much more to dig into. You see, we're going to continue to read in Paul, and he's going to talk about how there's going to be a lot of people who are going to try to change our outlook on that. In verses 8 and 9, he says, listen, if there is somebody out there, he says, but even if, I'm trying to get my computer back on track here. He says, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. He's saying, hey, listen, if somebody comes to you and tells you something different than what I taught you previously, let him be cursed. Let him be condemned to hell. That's basically what he's saying. Kick him out. There's no room for that. And he's even bringing it on to anybody that came with him. If they come back and they say, hey, sorry, change it. No, Paul said, when I came in here, I told you about the true gospel. And here next week, we're going to talk about how Paul can have the authority to mention that. How Paul can state It's like, man, how on earth? How on earth how can he even sit there and say that what he said was right and it couldn't have been anything else? Well, we're going to talk about that later. Guys, this is the only thing that really kind of pushes us in a different direction, is understanding the true gospel. The only thing that kind of drives us. This is something that we should be talking to ourselves every day, every morning. We wake up and we're praying to God and we're saying, remember the gospel. That will drive our day. Believe me, it drives our day. And it takes us to another level, to where we want to learn more and that we yearn to have a deeper understanding of it. And it's so weird because it is something simple. It's a small word. It's something that, that comes out so simple, but there's so much there. There's so much power in it. All too often I run into people who, we're discussing this, and one of their big things is that, well, how do I share that? And I fought with that for a long time. I fought with this idea of how to share it, and even after taking a couple evangelism courses, which is evangelism is the process of going out and sharing about Christ and about sharing the gospel with others, and even after taking some evangelism courses, it really kind of didn't set in for me. I tried to take that systematic approach, right? Check, here we go, and that didn't really work out for me. I had several failures in that, which is typical. But the one thing that really helped me is I heard a speaker once boil it down for me, and I realized that to boil it down in such a way draws out everything that I need. And he said, listen, the gospel, you can have the gospel in 4 words. And any of you speak, you've probably heard me say this. And the gospel in 4 words is Jesus in our place. All we have to remember is Jesus in our place. And then we let it go from there. If we've done our homework, we've done our studies, and we understand how Jesus impacted our lives, then all we start with is that. We say, hey, Jesus in our place. That's the gospel. And then we go from there. Right? So when I stand in front of people and I say, listen, I gotta share you something. You want to know what's going on in my life. You want to know how this is impacting my life. It's the gospel. The gospel is what impacts my life. And then they say, well, what is that? And you go, it's the fact that Jesus died in my place. And that throws off a bunch of questions, right? What? Jesus died in my place. You see, I am a sinner. And you start walking down that road, right? I'm a sinner, and I know it. And I know that without Jesus, I would die and go straight to hell. As I've heard so many speakers say, I would just break hell's gates wide open if it wasn't for Jesus. And in that, you sit there and you can just flesh out your life to them. And then they can begin to understand why it is important to have the gospel in their life. And you get to share, hey, what happened was Jesus so many years ago died on a cross because of me, because of you, because he knew that if he didn't die on the cross for you, we would not be able to have a relationship with God. God, who created us, loved us so much, and we made a very bad decision, and we separated ourselves from him. And because of that, God still loved us. He was disappointed, but he loved us so much still that he himself stepped out of heaven, sending his son, Jesus, to live a life that we could not live and to die a death that we deserved. And he was tortured and beaten and put on that cross. And in 3 days, 3 days later, God accepted his penalty for our sins and his sacrifice for our sins. And he rose. Jesus rose from the grave. That's the gospel. And the wonderful beauty of it all is that someday he's coming back again and we get to hang out with him for the rest of eternity. But here's the crazy part. Here's the part, right? Here's the catch. We have to say yes. You know, we have to say yes. In Romans, it says we have to confess with our mouth and believe in our heart that Jesus did do that. And that he did raise from the grave for us. That God sent and did the sacrifice for us so that we can have a direct relationship with him. He offered that gift for us. So I ask now, are you going to accept that gift? You know, all too often in class we're rushed and we're sitting here discussion and we're doing all this and never really get the time to really lay this out for anybody. But you know, guys, God speaks to us. As we open his word, he's speaking to us and he's giving us options. And he's telling us that these are things that can change your life. And each one of us has to make the decision to do it. Even as Christians, we are still hanging on to trying to make the right decisions. And God is saying, here, do that. And that's a yes or no question. Either yes, God, I will. Or, you know, God, I don't think so. I don't think I'm going to do that. Everybody makes a decision. Every time we've opened God's Word, every time we've come together, every time you've listened to me talk on these videos, we make a decision to either accept what God is trying to tell us and somehow apply it to our life, or to deny and reject it. Yes, I'm very black and white. That's how it works in God's world too. We'll either accept what he's saying and do and apply it. And by applying it to our life, we are able to gain a closer relationship with God. So as you're viewing this, as you're reviewing, I'm going to have the notes down below too. If there's any of you guys that want to ask questions about anything that I've said, if there's anything that you want to throw out there, did I get something off base? Throw it out there. You can set it up on you can set it on an email if you want to do it privately, or stick it in the comments. Be glad to discuss any of these areas. I'm going to have some notes that I've written in the comments as well. I do want to leave you with one note. This is one that I pulled out, and it really struck home with me, and I let it out in class as well. But it said, a man does not become a Christian merely by agreeing to do a set of doctrines. He becomes a Christian by submitting to Christ and trusting him. Let me ask you something. Have you been submitting your life to Christ? Have you been trusting him lately? I know many Christians who have stopped doing that. I know many Christians who have pushed away from God enough that it has become an issue. So guys, like I said, I'm praying for y'all. If there's any prayer requests, hit me up. If there's any comments you want to make on this, please do so. For my classmates, those who are coming to my Sunday school class on Sunday mornings, I have action steps for you guys. Share. Hit the share button. Share the video. Share this link. Invite people to the page. And then for those, if you want to, feel free to do so. Like I said, I wanted to keep it short. Looks like I'm going to keep it down to about 30-minute video. But there's a lot of content here. And so hopefully we're able to cut through this, and I'm hoping you guys will really take the time to watch this video, okay? Once again, I'm praying for you guys. God bless. Take care.